Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have an amazing speaker, Dan Goldman, the global head of strategy at North Face, as well as an advisor to quite a lot of startups as well, I saw. So Dan, introduce yourself, tell the people what you do, and yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Super excited to be here and have a chance to connect with you. Um, like you said, my title is Global Head of Strategy at the North Face. Broadly speaking, I oversee our strategy team, our consumer insights team, and what we call new growth platforms, which is innovation around business models. My career, about 20 years of consumer retail experience. And I'd broadly sum it up by saying my passion area is really around that intersection of consumer psychology and growth. So how do you connect more emotionally with your consumers to build that long-term sustained brand love that will drive your long-term brand equity?
So one of the things I'm hearing you say is obviously consumer psychology. The first thing I'm thinking, being more operational in my company, is that strategy is very much an analytical thing based on data, and then you must have an analytical mindset. But now I'm hearing consumer psychology, so then my assumption is, are you using more of a creative approach or more of a data approach when you do your things?
It really has to be a meld of both. I mean, obviously, like you, I think I typically would start from a place of analytics and a place of data and really build that foundation. But I think in today's world, consumers don't really want to engage with, companies that feel robotic. They want companies that feel human in a lot of ways. And you have to build that emotion in to really connect with consumers in a deeper way, especially if you think about the changing landscape with big kind of digital titans and an increasing set of competitors.
The North Face is pretty, it's a pretty established company at this point. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I buy is if I need to go hiking or something outdoors, the first thing I think is like, okay, I'll get North Face, and I have quite a lot of stuff from North Face as well.
Glad to hear.
But then when I compare that to startups, I mean, you are kind of with your feet in both areas, like startups as well as. Is the North Face a corporate? Does it feel like a corporate because it's so adventurous, or like how does it feel like compared to startups?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, we've been around for over 50 years. We're founded in the 60s, and the company was independent for a number of years, but is now owned by a publicly traded corporation called the VF Corporation, which has a family of brands like Vans, Timberland, and Dickies, to name a few. And in many ways, it does feel corporate, especially to a lot of your consumer or to your listeners who are coming from much smaller, more entrepreneurial companies. I think all companies at this point, need to evolve, need to bring in some of that agility, that startup mentality to succeed. And so we're trying to do that on many levels, but in many ways, we are a big corporation that moves, much slower than the startup world. So you're right to get right into that tension.
So I guess the interest that I would have, speaking like probably from where I'm coming from with Startup Funding Event, is so how many startups do you currently advise? What is the interaction like, and what do you get out of interacting with startup? Why do you even do it? You kind of have a job already, so why would you spend your time?
Yeah, I mean, for me, if I look back at my career, I think mentorship has played a huge role in terms of me personally getting to where I am today. So I enjoy that aspect of mentoring. But also, I've always had a passion for businesses and business growth, going back from my childhood and, some of the setting up my first lemonade stand all the way through when I was doing consulting before coming to North Face. I did a lot of work with private equity. Looking at companies of all sizes. So I think, it is that combination of, personal passion for business, for building brands, and building small brands and on an entrepreneurial scale requires the same toolkits in a lot of ways that I do work with at North Face, which is a much bigger brand. But the level of impact, being able to shape things, see things move quickly, I think is super exciting about the startup world that you may not get as much in a big corporation. So I currently work with a handful of startups, all in the consumer retail space, mostly consumer packaged goods, a lot of food, beverage, that type of thing. And really advising them around a number of different things, everything from kind of how do they think about kind of their brand strategy. So kind of what does their brand stand for? How does their, what should their brand equity be? Who are they really targeting? And do they really understand that consumer, not just the who the consumer is or what they're doing, but the why? I think people often overlook the why. And really understanding that why is so critical to designing a product that's going to be super relevant for them, but then also connecting with them from a marketing standpoint. And then a lot of the mentoring kind of goes into kind of that activation strategy of how do you bring the brand to life for a consumer. So everything from from a marketing standpoint, packaging, channel strategy. I think it's a lot of people want to jump straight to how do I get into a big store. And that may not be the right strategy. That often isn't the right strategy for a startup, because you might be able to get on the shelf, but if you don't have the velocity to stay on the shelf, you're going to be out in 6 months, and it's going to be really hard to regain that momentum. And then helping them think about valuation to some extent. I think valuations swing wildly between kind of tech companies that you've obviously spent a lot of time in, and more traditional consumer retail companies. And I think it's important that as founders think about their companies and think about fundraising, they're thinking about it appropriately, not just obviously for this round, as you know, but for future rounds, and being able to continue to show that valuation gain.
What would you think? What is the difference between a tech startup and their valuation, and then would be so interesting for me to hear, because sometimes I see businesses that brand themselves as a tech startup, but I'm not sure they are, and then obviously in valuation that means there are differences. So in the consumer retail, how is it different valuation wise, whether you're tech or not tech?
The valuations in consumer retail tend to be lower, obviously, than the tech. I think part of that is the time it takes to really scale a business. It tends to be a lot longer, and also just with the evolving landscape, what investors are really looking for and getting excited about. I think clearly they're seeing a lot of success on tech integrated or businesses that combine tech in some ways. And that is leading to valuations of more traditional companies being lower, and part of that is the growth cycle. It tends to take longer unless you can get in front of and scale it really quickly. It requires a lot more investment.
How would you calculate the valuation? Is it like the normal 3 to 5 times the profits per year, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the stage. I think as companies get bigger, you definitely look at profits. The initial, you look at more on the revenue side, growth rate side. You obviously look at comps in terms of what analogous companies have received from an investor standpoint. I think the tendency, and it seems to be more and more people want to put maybe too much price on sweat equity, which I think
what do you mean good with sweat equity?
Sweat equity being valuing the time they put into the business in their own work. And I think that's, professional investors don't always give you credit for that. They want to see the real results. As you know, they want to see whether it's eyeballs or sales or some kind of profit. But often, especially, it feels like more and more people are seeing valuations for other companies. And again, they may not be in the right necessarily perfect bullseye sector, but grasping on and saying, my company is worth $3 million, and I asked them how much sales they have, and they said, well, we haven't launched yet. We don't know. We're still working on our product. And it was just like, if the idea is that great, perfect. But if you can prove it out that it's going to be worth that through some piloting, you can get there. But from an investor standpoint, you have to think about what is their rate of return, when are they going to see money back, and kind of put yourself in their seat too. And also look thinking about who your investors should be from kind of what can they add to your company, what can they add to you to complement your skills, to push you, to advise you. It shouldn't just be about money early on.
Do you see differences between also European or maybe Asian versus American startups and how they approach the whole valuation and investor thing?
I mean, to be honest, from a startup standpoint, I've primarily worked with Americans, so it was hard. It would be hard for me to go across generalizations. I would say I see differences between men and women founders.
Really? How come?
I think the women founders, and again, the generalization is, I'm not sure it's a big enough sample size to be statistical, but I think women tend to be a little bit more realistic, or in terms of valuation, or in some cases maybe undervalue themselves, whereas you typically see oversized valuations from from guys more than women. I think that I think it's part of a bigger societal challenges, and there's been a lot of research in terms of kind of a confidence gap between men and women in terms of even kind of ask, if you're in a corporation, even men much more willing to ask for a raise than women. So I think it carries over to some extent.
Cool. Yeah, we actually did a Women in Tech event, and I did notice that. So maybe again, it was still a pretty big event, so I kind of noticed it across the board. Although I do have to say that sometimes one or two would pop up, but I think that's also with men in some cases. Although I do feel that there's more confidence with the men, but sometimes like one or two women would pop up and like do crazy things.
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
Cool things.
Absolutely.
Cool. Anyways, a lot of businessy because it was super interesting for me also from your perspective on the valuation and also for our audience. But there was one thing that you covered that I found quite interesting that I've been kind of exploring throughout the different episodes as well. You mentioned at one point mentorship is so important. And from my experience, people usually say that because they've had quite positive stories, experiences in their past. So I'd love to explore that and maybe ask you, what was the first time when you started seeing the value of a mentor? Where were you in your life? Was it like really early on? You said something about a lemonade stand, or was it like a bit later?
I mean, it was a bit later. I mean, obviously, I'm fortunate enough to have two great parents that helped inflict a lot of great values and principles on me,
Because where are you originally from?
I grew up mostly in the Boston area, Massachusetts, and then moved to San Francisco in the middle of high school. But kind of growing up in the Northeast in Boston and in a relatively small town, I remember, opening up my first lemonade stand as every year as soon as it got warm enough, you'd be out there. And then later that evolved for me actually opening up a store in our basement for neighborhood kids to come buy, candy or old toys, or we actually even sold rocks that we polished. So I kind of got my twin sister in on it with me. But that evolved to whether it was doing yard work or pet sitting or babysitting around the neighborhood. Kind of always that entrepreneurial spirit and kind of the business notion. And later, I did my first retail stint was as a sales associate at a store called Brookstone, which I don't know if it's over in Europe or was over in Europe, but it was a seller of a lot of different gadgets and kind of innovation type products around the house. So household technology products, travel products, even sold massage chairs. So it was kind of kind of one of those fun places. If there weren't that many consumers in the store, you could just at least play with all the toys, which was a ton of fun. But for me, there was always kind of a sense that I wanted to do something business associated, but I didn't really know what.
What's the difference from your perspective then with sales and business? Obviously there is a difference, but how did you discover it, and why wasn't sales enough for you?
I think it depends on how you define sales. I mean, for me, again, where I get my energy, where I get my passion is building or fixing brands. Um, it took me a while to figure out how to kind of hone in on that. And I think every experience that I've had throughout my career has kind of helped really lead me there. But there was something about, you know, either starting something, building something, or fixing something that just energizes me. You know, if things are going great and it's just kind of status quo, I tend to get a little bit bored. I think it's probably like a lot of your startup founders that you work with. It's just kind of this constant energy of wanting to do something, and you know, tends to get bored sitting around and just relaxing too much.
Do you feel like, maybe completely outside question, but do you feel like that attitude also applies to non-business things like sports, or do you feel like you do more activities outside of business because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my, obviously being at the North Face, part of that is I've always loved to be outdoors. You know, whether it's sports or hiking. I'm also I have a passion to travel. I've been to over 70 plus countries around the world, and for me, you know, one of the hardest things about COVID is being at home. And not that I don't love my home, but I think it's the longest I haven't been on a plane and traveled to a new place in at least a decade.
What do
And
you
there's
usually do when you travel?
for me, I tend to like trips that are kind of have a mix of things. So I like the adventure, I like the little bit of culture, and then a little bit of relaxation. But kind of that perfect mix of, keep it going. But we tend to go pick a place, and part of it we plan, and part of it we figure out while we're over there. So we were actually had planned to do a vacation the last couple of weeks over in Croatia, Bosnia, and Montenegro, and really just rent a car for 2 weeks, drive around, and had a couple things that we wanted to see and check off, but a lot of it was just getting immersed and stopping in the small towns and meeting people and having great food. So mixed in with some hiking and some other adventure. So for us, that's the perfect trip. But we were able to sneak away, and some of the national parks have started opening up in the U.S. So we got outside and did a week of great hiking out in Utah.
Yeah, I heard Utah has a lot of. They also run a lot of marathons there. I heard, and trail hikes as well. But can you tell me maybe one of the most interesting places you've been to?
Oh, I would say. What place we actually went a couple of years ago? Bhutan, which is a small Himalayan kingdom next to kind of below China, above India.
Yeah.
And it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous country, and it's one of these countries that you need to kind of apply to go to. They only let a certain number of people in, and it's just kind of gorgeous countryside and really interesting culture, and some great hikes as well. So it was just a really nice mix, and something kind of very unique, getting off kind of the beaten track a little bit. I like elements where you're kind of getting off the beaten track.
Nice. Sorry. Okay, so going back to mentorship.
Yeah, we get off topic.
No, to me it's interesting to explore also. I've noticed with my attitude, which you said as well, like I always get restless when I don't have enough activity in my life. With Corona, it's been popping up that I just want to do more. And obviously I just wanted to see how others do it and what they do. And hiking is definitely something interesting that I've been exploring as well, but not doing a lot yet. But back to mentorship. So you were kind of explaining your story, but when was the first time you actually felt you had a mentor and it really like affected it, and how did you go about it? Was it really like, hey, do you want to be my mentor, or was it just like something that happened?
So at my first job out of college, I was at a very small consulting firm outside of New York City. It was called Cannondale Associates, and it was about 25 people, and had a group of about 7 partners there. And what I was, it's not a company that most people have ever heard of, or it actually got bought years ago and no longer kind of totally around. But I was very fortunate. The partners there really focused on mentorship and development of kind of the analysts and associates coming in. And, it was the first time where it was one of these non-hierarchical companies. So as the newest people in the firm, you're working with the most senior people, as opposed to some of the bigger consulting companies that may be, pretty layered. And so there was the development on the professional side, but also just to hear their stories. It was something that we started with them, was, setting up, I think it was monthly kind of lunch and learns, where each one of them would kind of cycle through and kind of talk to us about their stories, some of the things they're working on, things like that. And one of the things that really helped me figure out at least the next 4 or 5 years of my life at that point was just seeing what their path was. And they all had a common theme of they all went to business school, and then after business school worked at big consumer packaged good companies. So the Procter and Gamble's or the Mondeleze's or the PepsiCo's of the world, and then had moved into consulting. And the notion of, and there's no knock on people that go straight to consulting, but they really valued the business school experience. But then what they said is, after business school, you almost need sort of a finishing school. And by going to a big company that's done it before, you can learn a lot, even if that's not where you want to stay. And some of that philosophy is dated now. This was almost 20 years ago, and they had done it 20 years before that. But for me,
how is it dated now? What's the difference?
Well, there wasn't a startup world as much, at least in the United States, and back then, I think there were a handful of companies you could point to, at least in the U.S., that said, if you can go to one of those companies, just from a training standpoint, people, if you look at CEOs from other industries, they're coming from a handful of those programs. So whether it's Procter and Gamble, or General Electric back even before that, or the Pepsis, the Krafts, the Coca-Colas, they were feeders for a lot of other businesses, regardless of whether you stayed specifically in consumer packaged goods. So I think just being able to understand their story, understand what they got out of both business school as well as going to one of those companies was super helpful, because I had actually gone to liberal arts college, university. And so while I had majored in economics, I had never taken a marketing class, I had never taken a finance class, I had never taken an accounting class. Through my consulting, I did consulting for about 4 years before business school. I learned a lot. I got exposed to a lot of different business models, but you're still only seeing kind of a slice of a company. And to be, ingrained in the middle of it, there's a tremendous amount of value there. So really, while they never pushed and said, we want you, we think you should, this is the only right way, it was clear from the value they got out of it and how they talked about those experiences of first business school and then going to a big consumer packaged good company, that there was value that I thought I could also see in my career, regardless of where I ended up.
But what was so why consumer pack? I mean, I understand, Kraft and Procter and Gamble, they're big companies,
Yeah.
and graduating through university, their recruiters are really good. But it's like, when you talk about it, it's consumer packaging. It's not. Well,
It's not. Yeah, it's not
yeah.
NASA. It's not launching
Yeah, it's not.
rockets.
It's not. It's like you said.
Exactly.
It's not NASA or something like that. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
what is it about those companies that is so good? Like, what do they teach you exactly that you would say, okay, obviously consumer packaging after business school?
Yeah. So after business school, in business school I interned at Kraft, what was then Kraft Foods, which is now Mondelez, and then I went to Procter and Gamble for 3 years and did brand management there. And I can tell you, I'm happy to talk more about that. I think the training is so excellent in terms of really understanding how to build a brand and how to grow a brand. And I think those principles apply to selling. The products I worked on were Mr. Clean, which is household cleaners, and then I worked on Gillette, so personal care products for men, right? But the same principles apply for cleaning products in terms of how you build a brand. You start with your consumer. You figure out what do you stand for, how do you want to reach them, how do you innovate and meet new consumer demands. What's the appropriate way to do research to really understand? How do you work and think about the channels you're going to sell through, and how do you think about growth and long-term sustained growth? So those same principles apply. Well, I think the mechanism of consumer packaged goods or these companies is, one, there's a tremendous amount of training, and then two, it's a structured way to think about it, and just the lessons learned from. I think if you think about consumer packaged goods, it's probably one of the most competitive industries, because if you're buying, let's just say, a bar of soap, on the shelf you've got 20 different varieties, right?
Right.
So if you can win in that environment, you can probably win in any environment where, every little thing you do matters. So I do think the competitive nature, and you're fighting for half a point of market share, a point of market share, and that could mean millions and millions of dollars. But I think the competitive nature, in many ways, you're selling commodities. And, sometimes there's functional benefits that you do better than others. You've got new innovation, but how do you really build a brand that connects with people, that your consumers understand that they're willing to pay more for? Because there's always going to be private label there that's 20-30% cheaper, right?
Yeah.
And if you can win against that, then you should be able to win and apply those principles to any sort of industry.
But so far, it's everything you're saying, I agree, but it's super abstract. Do you have, I learn mostly from stories. So do you have like stories that you can share, that you're allowed to share from your times back then, or maybe how you applied it to startups to really like shape? You said something about a structure, and obviously a lot of people talk about the why and the golden circle and everything, but
yep.
Do you have a story to share where you really can show the practicality of everything you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share a couple. I'll start with my experience on Mr. Clean. Again, household cleaning products, not the most exciting category ever. But for Procter & Gamble, it was one of our smaller brands. It was about 500 million or something back then, at least in the Americas. And so I came in and I actually inherited a part of a business that just launched. They had tried to launch disinfecting wipes, which now are super relevant. Back then, there were if you looked at the market share, you had three big players. You had Clorox, Lysol, and then private label. They accounted for the majority of the category. And so what the innovation that they had launched right before I joined was they had done research to identify what were consumers' barriers or issues with the current product offering. And so this is going to sound really silly, but one of the barriers they found out was consumers got frustrated by, if you've ever used disinfecting wipes, they usually come in a round canister, and when you pull them, multiple ones come out, and They sometimes don't tear very easily. So the innovation was, well, let's change the packaging form, and let's change how these things fit together. So think about it more like a tissue box. When you pull one, only one comes out, right? And as opposed to being wrapped together, they're kind of interwoven and kind of folded next to each other. So with that, they invested several $1 million in new packaging molds. They invested in different kind of cloth sheets. And the challenge with that was what it did from a cost of goods sold was really increase how much we had to charge per sheet versus the competition. I think what they also failed to understand was what is the brand equity versus the competitors. At least in the United States, if you're not familiar with Clorox and Lysol, they're both known for disinfecting, kill everything. One does it in a little bit more positive way. The other one does it in the notion of showing you all the creepy germs and viruses and kind of do it more from prevention standpoint. What Mr. Clean always stood for was a good, thorough clean. but actually, as we dug in, because I inherited this business, there that is different from disinfecting, as silly as that sounds. So as I inherited this business, they had a big initial launch, and then sales basically flattened, and then didn't really move and started falling. And so my job was to figure out what could we do about this, and basically looked into the cost of goods versus the competitors. When we launched, obviously competitors cut their prices, went super promotional. That hurt us even more. We didn't have the disinfecting equity. And then there was something as silly as we changed the shape of the canister, which people are trained to think about a round canister. We came out with a little bit more of a square canister. And as silly as that sounds, when people looked at it on the shelf, they didn't associate with the category. So if you think about kind of lessons learned, not understanding the competition in the market and what actually matters most. In this category, it was disinfecting and then price. And we were coming higher priced and from a point of less disinfecting equity. And then the last part about just consumers didn't identify what we were. So there are kind of clear lessons you can learn in terms of how you position your brand, where you should be innovating, what problems you should be solving, and is your innovation worth an increase in price versus what their offering is now. In this case, the problem that we were solving was maybe third or fourth on the list of what they were buying the product for, and consumers aren't going to pay more when you're solving a third or fourth oriented problem. So
what was the first and second problem then?
It was really around quick disinfecting, and then they wanted something low price because they were disposable, one-time use products. So it does show you in terms of you can do a lot of great innovation, but if consumers aren't willing to pay for it because it's not solving a real problem, it doesn't really matter.
That's a really good lesson. The two questions pop up for me. So on the one side, so what did you then exactly do that fixed it, and how did you know that you fixed it? And also second, this is like 10, 15 years ago, because Procter & Gamble mentioned. This is, I don't know how good was Google, Facebook ads back then. How did you research all of this? How did you know what was number one, number two?
Yeah. So I'll start with kind of the research, the data. It was a time where we were just really starting with, while Google was around, but like search engine marketing, search engine optimization, really web, but most, all the sales were really in store. So you have access to retailer data in the U.S. Through a couple different companies. One's called IRI, the other one's Nielsen. So you could track sales at a kind of a weekly level, at a very granular level, for both us and the competition. But that only told you what happened previously. What doesn't tell you the why. And I think the why is, again, the most important thing. And so we actually went into people's homes and consumers' homes through consumer research. So we recruited consumers to let us go into their homes, understand how they're using the products, ours versus the competitors. We did shop-alongs with consumers to watch them actually shop the shelf and understand kind of what draws them in. And that's where, again, the notion of understanding priority of how they're shopped. So if you think about a consumer decision tree, a consumer decision tree lays out choices being made, and you think about the top choice being the most important, and then each kind of other branch of the tree being the kind of the next factor. And so what you want to do is, as a kind of business, is you want to map out that tree and make sure that you're solving the most important the problems for them. And so through that research, we were able to say, okay, disinfecting number one, price number two, and then maybe quality of the wetness and quality of the cloth, and then number three or four was how easy they came off. So it really was that research, both in the store, watching consumers shop, seeing how they walked right by our product because it wasn't the canister, the shape that they expected. And then even when we pointed it out, then doing the price comparison. um, so it actually is
But
interesting.
so how did you call them up, or did you send in a mail and ask, or you offered them money? How much money
Yeah.
did you offer them to come along and shop with them? How did it work?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, what you do for consumer research, there's a bunch of different methods. But when you're doing in-person research, you'll tend to work with recruiting agencies. You give them a set of specifications in terms of the types of consumers you want to recruit. So you would, say we want, these types of demographics. We want primary household shoppers, so people that actually go and do their grocery shopping. We want people that purchase in this category X times per year. So you're not just getting kind of occasional one-time buyers, but the people that make up the bulk of the sales. And then you would probably get a mix of consumers. So consumers that have bought your product in the past, and then consumers that have just bought your competitors. Because you don't want to just talk to your own consumers, because then you'll never hear what's wrong, right? And you want to contrast that. So you pay them it tends to be like $100 or for an hour, or if it's going to go longer, maybe $150, $200. And it sort of depends on how much. If you're going into somebody's home, you may pay them a little bit more than if you're having them meet you in store. But basically what we identified, and again, the company had locked themselves into a cost structure just that wasn't competitive. And so ultimately, my recommendation to our company was, we need to exit this business. This is not a business we can successfully compete in.
Really? Exit? Why?
Because it wasn't a business that we can make money in. And sometimes we can spend a lot of money innovating, building molds, setting up the production. But if you're going to have to spend millions and millions more dollars just to market it and try to get some sales out of it, unless you think you can capture a sufficient market share, it just doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint. You're better putting your money, your investments, towards something else that you can grow and scale. And sometimes it's better just to cut your losses and kind of reestablish what you're good at and grow that way, versus trying to push water uphill in some place that maybe if you had done your research right the first time, you would have realized you don't really have a right to play, or at least a right to win. So I think I was one of the only people at Procter & Gamble ever to have a month of negative shipments, where you actually get more returns than you send out. But strategically, my effort then shifted to, how do you exit a business in a way that's gonna save you as much money as possible? So how do you move inventory to maybe outlet or kind of secondary sellers that can help you just move through inventory, and you may only be getting 10 cents on the dollar, but if you don't move that product, then you actually have to pay somebody to scrap it and destroy it. How do you think about if you've built molds and supply chain, how do you think about exiting some of that in a cost efficient way? So it was really a lesson. This was kind of one of my first assignments there, so it was kind of an eye-opening awakening of, you go to a brand, you're excited, you're ready to grow it. And in this case, my first scenario was, let's exit a business. And that was not an easy recommendation to make after they had spent millions to launch it. But it was the right decision. And I think I learned as much about, from business from that experience than I did from anything else I've done in my career.
What was their reaction when you first, because you're not like super experienced at this point. This is somewhere
Yeah.
in the beginning of your career, and you come to them and they just spend millions, and you pretty much say, let's exit this thing. What was their reaction? But also, exiting like this business, which you're saying is super relevant to now Corona and everything, what's happening. I would love if you could go deeper into maybe the practicalities of what you had to do to make it as efficient and like less negative, or more as profitable as possible as you could, obviously under circumstances. So what was their reaction, and what did you do exactly?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because it was not an easy conversation, as you can imagine. Um, I mean, first and foremost, it wasn't a snap decision. Obviously, it was we did multiple months of research, evaluation, um, and we did try some intervention strategies along the way to see if it changed any of the trajectory. We tried to put change some of the labels to see by playing up and calling out more specifically disinfecting in a stronger way. Does that move the needle? We actually tried changing the color of a canister because most disinfecting wipes are white canisters. The way we launched originally was blue. So blue means a little bit different to consumers, and color is really important when it comes to branding. So if you switch it to white, does that move the needle? And again, what we saw was because while you could fix some of the things in the periphery, because you couldn't fix your cost structure, you could never be competitive on price because you couldn't fix what your brand stood for at a macro level. You always have that second guess in consumers' minds of, well, they say disinfecting, but are they as disinfecting as these competitors? Even though we say, kills 99.9% of germs, just like they did. There is that doubt because other brands have built up years and years of equity, spending millions of dollars, and I think consumers, consumers remember that. They may not play that back when you ask them, but intuitively when they make decisions, they understand that. And that is, I talked about kind of my passion around emotional connectivity. The emotion, consumers aren't always rational, right? Customers aren't always rational. And so you have to connect with them on multiple levels. It isn't just about the functionality of a product. Functionally, Apple wasn't the best music player when they launched, right? They aren't technically the best phone, but there's an emotion, there's a design, there's something deeper that you connect with, and you've got to be able to do both. And so, when we laid out this, all the evidence in terms of why it wasn't going to work, and you lay out future scenarios of what would it take to make the business profitable, and not just break even profitable, but meaningful enough to invest. The ROI on that was, when you lay it out in that way, is so obvious that it becomes a decision of, okay, this is the right thing to do from the business. Let's understand where we went wrong, how we can make sure we don't make these mistakes in the future. But the evidence in the data speaks for itself, and that's where you do have to blend the data, the analytics, with understanding the emotion. I know you brought up you tend to start with the analytics, and I think it is ultimately important from a business case standpoint.
So your boss was okay with it? Just he saw the data and was like,
Yeah,
okay.
my boss wasn't the hard part. It's Procter and Gamble is one of these organizations you have to go up like 5 levels to, but my boss and even his boss we had kind of brought along on the journey, but ultimately kind of the next layer up, we had to make the pitch, and it was a tough meeting. At Procter and Gamble, you basically had to write a 1-page memo. They don't do PowerPoints, they don't do anything like that, but you have to articulate it on 1 page with the notion of, if you can't say it in 1 page, either it's you don't really understand it, or it's too complex. And so the focus of 1 page really focuses you on what's the most important information, and how do you lay up a story and really be able to articulate really clearly to your stakeholders, whether they're internal or external. And I think, as I work with some founders and as they build their pitch decks, I think sometimes when they start building their pitch decks, they don't necessarily know what story they're trying to tell. And I think really being sharp on what is that message before you put pen to paper on the pages is really important, because otherwise you can have some really beautiful pages that really don't say anything and aren't necessarily the most important things about your product.
So in short, if you're creating a pitch deck, it would technically have to fit all on 1 page, and then you just make it a little bit nicer.
It could be a lot. Obviously it would be a small font, and you may have some graphs or something like that, or pictures posted in. But it was one word page was the limit.
Okay, so then take us through the the practicalities, also maybe relating a little bit more to this time with Corona happening in some
Yeah.
businesses, because a lot of these businesses that might go bankrupt right now, I saw J. Crew's going bankrupt and stuff like that, and all these companies that, and a lot of small businesses as well, they don't have the experience from Procter and Gamble. So what were you exactly doing that could be relevant for small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in that example, again, that was one very small part of an overall brand. And I think at times like this, one, I think cash flow is super important in understanding how do you maximize how you're spending your dollars. And I think what that story illustrates for Mr. Clean is there are better way. You could spend a lot of time and a lot of money trying to grow a business, a part of a business that ultimately isn't going to pay off. And sometimes you're better kind of doubling down on what you do best or trying to pivot what you do best. And especially at times like COVID, because your cash flow is limited, the dollars, even if you've raised millions of dollars, I think investors are more concerned than ever about burn rates, right? And you want to maximize your ROI. And I think that's both a short-term conversation and a long-term conversation. And sometimes maybe you can get some quick dollars quickly, but is it long-term sustainable? And you as a startup founder or kind of a leader of a startup, you've got limited capacity, limited mind share. Your organization has limited capacity, limited mind share. So how do you focus them on the most important things, especially in times like this? And at North Face, a lot of the work we've been doing, COVID, the first thing we did was put together a COVID playbook to figure out what are the must-do priorities. And thinking about cash flow is definitely one at the top of it. But then thinking about our community, both internally and externally, and then the third thing was simplification. So what can we stop doing? How can we focus? There was a lot of work in terms of, look, in normal times we can have a really broad product assortment. Now we're probably better kind of shrinking our product assortment, because if you think about it, every extra product you make requires internal resources to build, the sample creation, and then it leads to inventory. So inventory in the marketplace where you actually have to put out cash to create product before you sell it. And right now, cash is king and inventory equals cash. So you're better off shrinking, focusing, and doing more with less. And I think sometimes in situations like this, people try to kind of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And sometimes that's the right approach. And in times like this, I think focus and discipline is probably as important.
So, taking back to the Mr. Clean example, because obviously I'm with my head in that story
Yeah,
right
yeah.
now. Although I do think it's important to know how you guys are doing it at the North Face right now. But taking back to the Mr. Clean story, so take me through the practicality. You just, convinced the people on this one pager, you got to exit. So, what happens now? You look at how much cash flow you have and then you just pull everything back, or like what is
Yeah.
happening?
So in this case, Procter and Gamble and Mr. Clean weren't really worried about cash flow, or you know, but it was about how do you maximize, like we said, kind of fiscal responsibility and in minimizing the cost of exiting. So the first things we did were look at our inventory situation, both what we had in our kind of distribution centers and also what our customers were sitting on. And um, you know, what we did was first work with our customers that had product and figure out how we could help them move through that product. So often that means having the product go on promotion. And when you go into a grocery store, what you may not realize is typically it's the manufacturer that's paying for the promotion so that the retailer's margin stays the same. And so we actually worked with them to, give them promotion dollars to move through inventory quicker. and then we worked with kind of what product we had in our distribution centers, and we identified some outlets that kind of move through distressed product. So there's a big chain in the United States called Big Lots, which basically has closeout product, and it sells. The manufacturers sell it at much reduced cost to them, and then they sell it at much reduced cost to consumers. So identifying partners like that to move through the inventory, and then go ahead.
Yeah, so when we see, like, if I walk into a store, a supermarket or something like that, and I see 1+1 or like some big promotion that I don't understand how they make money on that, that's actually the manufacturer saying, hey, we need to kind of cut this, or we need to move on to the next thing, so we need to go through the rest. That's not the store pretty much saying, oh, we don't want this anymore. It's the manufacturer.
Usually it's the manufacturer, and it's and that's in grocery stores. Every once in a while, the stores will do their own, where they're trying to strategically pivot, or they're doing things. But usually it's the manufacturing. So when you get coupons or anything like that, it's not the store that's paying for those. It's the manufacturer.
So how does Black Friday work on a technical level? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the store? And how do people make profits on that?
Yeah, and that can be a combination of both. I mean, Black Friday, and again, I can speak probably, it's less from a grocery standpoint, more obviously when you're talking about electronics or clothing or things like that. I mean, I think Black Friday, you have to figure out what's the right promotion. And I think, more and more, Black Friday has gotten expanded. So it's not just one day, it's now multiple weeks. And you have Cyber Monday, but it's really about that whole March. So the best thing to do is think about it in terms of what is your holiday strategy, not necessarily what is just your Black Friday strategy, because it all has to fit together. And different retailers or different brands can go down to different promotion levels based on their own internal margins, right? And I think it's trying to navigate what is your objective for the season. So how much profit are you willing to sacrifice for volume, or how much margin are you willing to sacrifice for dollar profit? But more and more what you see is brands and retailers trying to be more strategic with their promotions, make it less about let's put everything on sale versus let's put a select set of items on sale. Let's actually use it as a window to launch new products and drive attention and awareness around those. But there is more focus going on to be how do you be more strategic? Can you as a brand like North Face, can you use Black Friday as a way to acquire consumers and get them to sign up for your loyalty program, not just go buy stuff? And can it serve a longer term? You think about the life cycle of a consumer, and using that as one acquisition opportunity.
So when you were at doing the wrap up of the Mr. Clean, you were doing those promotions like 1+1, but then to me it sounds like you weren't actually losing money on that. The margins just grew smaller.
Yeah, in that case, when you're kind of moving through the inventory with your kind of regular price retailers, you're not necessarily losing money. When you're doing the closeout, that's where you may be taking some sales at less than the cost of goods, where you may lose a little bit of money. But again, the alternative at that point is scrapping it or paying somebody to destroy it, which it actually cost money.
But then one of the things I learned very early on in business was something that is, I think, called the Amazon model, where Jeff Bezos pretty much would go into an industry, outprice everybody by putting his prices super low, and then either businesses would go bankrupt or they would somehow follow along and join either Amazon or something. So my question is then, it feels to me like if you would have that promotion going on for a very long time and pretty much shrink your margins to a point where it's just like break even, wouldn't you at one point have so many consumers that actually like your product that you would outcompete your competitors?
I think there's two dynamics to that. One is really understanding your cost economics relative to your competitors. because if you drop your price, your competitors are likely going to drop their price. And so if their ultimate cost structure is lower than your ultimate cost structure, they can maintain that far longer than you can, right?
Yeah.
So you can do that and not make any money and ruin the kind of economic profit pie for everybody. But unless you either have so much sitting on such a pool of cash that you can just outlast everybody, or your cost structure is lower, then it's not a winning game. The other thing, especially for lifestyle brands, apparel, brands where you're trying to build more emotional connection, that dilutes brand equity. And you have to think about, you've trained the consumer to only buy you when you're cheaper. And if you start raising your price 30% more, that our consumer is going to come back. Are they going to keep spending? And in kind of products like disinfecting wipes, are the barriers, if you knock out your competitors by lowering the price and then raise your price back up, the barriers to entry are low enough that somebody else can come in once the profit pool is big enough, right? And do the same to you. So I think you have to think about the long game, not just the short game. For me, you talked about J. Crew, you talked about some of the other apparel companies. In the short term, the easy answer is to go heavy promotional. That doesn't help you in the long term. I think the more you can do to figure out what is the right equilibrium between demand and supply, the better your brand's going to be from a health standpoint long term.
So if you're going for an exit strategy, it's smart to do it because you guys weren't going to do Mr. Clean disinfectant anyways.
We had nothing to lose. The only thing we had to lose was paying more to get rid of, to get product destroyed at that point. So for every dollar that we were moving, even if it was very low price, at least it was a dollar coming back versus, again, having to eat all that cost plus pay for disposal. So in that case, and at that point, it wasn't so much inventory that it was flooding the market. It wasn't like there were millions and millions and millions of canisters. Our supply chain was smart enough from a demand forecasting standpoint that once we saw that we were not on the trajectory that we initially planned, to cut back on production. So, and I think that is important to think about as you're building a business. Is supply chain inventory is so important, both from kind of managing the brand, but managing your cost and your cash flow.
So were you able to get everything out just with that one strategy, or were you doing other things as well?
Yeah, between the promotions to our initial full price retailers and then the closeout sales to kind of brand retailers like Big Lots, we were able to get everything. And then lucky for me, I was able to pivot to other parts of the business, which I got to lead a growth and turnaround strategy. I took a different part of our business from its lowest point ever to its highest point. Got to reset the innovation pipeline and really reposition the brand to be successful long term. So it was a great learning experience for the wipes, but then the experience. Then I got to prove that I could actually take a business, turn it around, and really grow it, and that was super exciting too.
Can you share that story? Because obviously you said you advise, right? So it doesn't have to be that story. Maybe one that is more clear, or maybe that one is the clearest one. Can you share a story where it was like at the bottom and then you turned it around? Because I noticed that a lot of businesses operationally sometimes lack, and because of that operational meltdown or a system doesn't work, things just go really bad, and somehow one person can walk in and turn everything around. Can you share maybe a story of how you did it?
I'll talk about that next Mr. Clean experience, just because in consulting you get to do it a lot as well, but it's a little bit harder from client confidentiality to give real examples. I moved over to manage what was called our Mr. Clean Magic Eraser, which is a different, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's essentially a cleaning product that takes marks off of walls or scrubs really really tough situations. It's like kind of an extreme clean, and at the time, Procter and Gamble was focused on scale. And so you had products and innovation that were working in one part of its company or portfolio that they then tried to reapply to other areas. One of these examples was something called Febreze. I don't know if
Yeah.
Febreze is okay. So at the time, Febreze was famous because, at least in the United States, when you went out to bars or restaurants, people smoked a lot, and then you'd come home and you'd
Yeah, same
kind
here.
of right. So Febreze took off wildly. And they started injecting it in a bunch of other things just as an added benefit because the brand was so hot. So one of the examples is they tried to inject it into these cleaning products. And it was just kind of an irrelevant innovation in this category at the time. And what basically what happened was they launched this innovation with the Febreze in it, and when they did that, they actually took off packages of bigger sizes. And this is a category where pantry loading is important because if it's in your house, you used it a lot, but you don't always remember to buy it. They changed the marketing message to be around great smelling, which again is not a benefit that consumers care about with this type of product. And then those were the two big things. And again, so I came in, the business had declined. I did the similar business diagnostic that I did on the Mr. Clean wipes. We went into people's homes, saw how people used the product. We went into stores, saw how they shopped the product. There weren't really competitors in this case. This was kind of a product that only we had. And then we really got into the difference between why people loved the product and why the people weren't buying it, and why the ones that did buy it but didn't like it kind of hated it. And what we found was this innovation had basically derailed kind of what the product was famous for. And actually what we saw was when people bought this innovation, their likeliness to repurchase the brand in the future was far lower than if they bought one of our main products. So the first thing we did was take out that product, take it out of distribution, put back on large sizes. We changed our we wanted to create a new marketing campaign and new TV campaigns, digital campaigns, but in the interim we actually took an old TV campaign from a couple of years ago and put that back on air. And as soon as we started doing those, we saw the brand turn around. And it was something so simple, but again, it was the notion of really understanding who you are as a company, really understanding who your consumers are and what they expect from you, what they want from you, and why they buy you. And it's, again, the notion of innovation is so important, so relevant, but you need to have innovation that connects with people and is meaningful. The marketing message, everything has to align to that. And as soon as you get a couple things out of whack, it's kind of the wheels fall off. And if you kind of go back to your broader message of what you were talking about before, of there's companies where it feels like all the operations have fallen apart. It tends to be there's one or two things that threw everybody off and that led them down the wrong path. And oftentimes, you can see it in my current role as kind of head of strategy at North Face. It starts with kind of what is the strategy of the company, and do people understand it? Is it simple enough? And is it pointing people left or is it pointing people right? And you just have to make sure that everybody's marching in that same direction, because as soon as some people march in one direction, some people march in a different direction, you kind of go out of whack. So I think it is really important to be clear about kind of what is your brand, who are your consumers, and what are you doing to win with them. And if everybody understands that, then people can march together. But I think it's much harder at big companies where you've got several different functions, people not necessarily talking to each other on a daily standpoint. I think at startups, that's where you've got the advantage of you've got a small team, you're lean, you're agile. But again, if take the tech example, if your engineers are running in one direction and your marketers are talking about something else, then your customers are going to get really confused really quickly.
So, what I get out of your stories, that in order to get your message across, and because I notice a lot of people don't do that, and I used to not do that in the beginning of my career as well, is you really need to talk to your consumer and see them in their natural habitat where they would buy your product. Because that's kind of the common thread that I found in your story of the Mr. Clean. You guys literally paid $100 just to see them shop or use the product at their homes.
Absolutely. I mean, what I would say is I think there's three ingredients to be super successful in building a brand and building a company. The first is definitely consumer obsession, and you really understanding not just the who and the what they're doing, but the why, and really getting underneath that. I mentioned before I have a twin sister. We both bought, before I was at North Face, Nike running shoes. They were very similar Nike running shoes, but we bought them for very different reasons. She bought them because she was always a runner and she thought they were the best shoes for her to run. I bought them because they were actually the smallest, lightest shoes, and I travel a lot, and they would fold up, right? And I could put them in my bag, and they take up minimal space. So if you're Nike and you're designing a product for her, you've probably nailed it. And if you want a message to her about marketing, in marketing around running, she's going to buy more from you. You could probably have built a better product for me. And if you message to me about running, I'm not going to respond to that because I'm not a big runner. So it's just one small example of why the consumer obsession is important in terms of really understanding not just the who and the what, but the underlying motivations of what need that you're trying to solve for. And unless you identify a need that's really relevant for the consumer, you're going to be missing something. So that consumer obsession is really important. The second thing I'd say is a competitive moat is really critical. And what that means is what differentiates you in a way that your competition can't copy. And I think there's two different ways to drive a really strong competitive moat. One is what I'd call being a superhero brand or business, and the other one's being a superhuman business. If you're a superhero business, that means you've got some kind of technology or functional or operational advantage. So you gave the Amazon's got scale. They've got operational efficiencies. You look at other tech companies, they've got patents that their products just can't be copied. Even if you think about Coca-Cola or McDonald's, they've got special secret formulas that you can't copy. Other people can try, but the taste isn't the same, right? Yeah. On the flip side, you can be superhuman, and what that means is really you've got a logo, and then what does that logo stand for, and does it connect more than just function? So lots of people sell great functional jackets, but people are willing to pay more for a North Face jacket because that logo stands for something and they want to be a part of it. And the more you can drive up that emotion, that's something that in a day and age where you've got Amazon or other players out there that can knock off your design, knock off everything, what they can't knock off is your logo. And that helps you be Amazon proof or competitive proof. So whereas on the superhero side, kind of that tech advantage, I think it's really critical to continue to pivot, continue to innovate on that, continue to make that stronger, because sooner or later a different superhero brand is going to come along that's going to be stronger than you, or do what you do better, or make what you're doing obsolete, right? And so in the retail world, you saw that with, back in the day, it used to be mom and pop stores, and then kind of regional chains came around and they kind of knocked a lot of those out of business. Then national chains came along and knocked the regional guys out of business. Then Amazon came along and knocked a lot of those guys out of business, right? And Amazon's on top now, but flash forward 10 years, it's probably going to be somebody else, or so it's really hard to stay on top if you're kind of a superhero brand, unless you're innovating, unless you're really understanding that your consumer, so that you can continue to pivot and make sure that your advantage stays an advantage and you can keep outrunning. And it's the old Polaroid example of they could have launched a digital camera, but they wanted to protect the profit pools of their so unless you pivot, you're going to lose.
Yeah. You actually touched something that I wanted to ask you. You said, there's constant innovation happening and these pivots need to happen. And then, the national got covered by Amazon, and then in 10 years, maybe Amazon will vanish. So, my question to you is, you've been 20 years in this business now. Do you think something will be able to knock an Amazon off? Obviously, Amazon innovates a lot. Or how will it change? Because, the mom and pops got covered by the regional ones. The regional ones got covered by the national ones. But Amazon is global and it's online. I feel like it's like it hit the pinnacle of innovation of how we can go. Or am I wrong?
I mean, I think you would have said that, at least in the United States, 10 years ago about Walmart. Or, you would have said that back in the day about Sears. That these businesses are so big, nobody could possibly challenge them for supremacy. I think the exciting thing about the world we live in is this notion that there's entrepreneurs out there around the world now that can develop businesses in their basements or in their garages that can rival over time some of the biggest and strongest companies out there. And so I don't know who or what it will be to challenge Amazon, but I do think there will be something. And it only takes a little bit of change in consumer behavior. I mean, if all of a sudden consumers stop going to Amazon to buy products because it becomes super easy to do buying of products on social, and social buying becomes the thing, maybe Amazon's kind of pivots, it has to pivot its role eventually to be more of just the fulfillment and not the front end. Or maybe they learn, they pivot, and they figure out how to embed Amazon selling into social. But it's sort of, consumer behavior is going to continue to evolve as new innovative platforms come out there, and with that, shopping and buying habits will. And so if Amazon continues to invest and innovate, they can stay on top, but there'll be something that comes to rival them.
Have you seen any tech or trend, something new that potentially could challenge it? Can you share something?
And to be honest, no. I mean, not on a scale big enough to even say it's, but I think this is when looking back on history tells you that if you think the status quo today is going to last forever, you'll lose. And, you need to innovate, you need to change. You need to kind of look out and continue to monitor kind of who's new, what's exciting, pilot, test, experiment, and even if most of those fail, you'll learn from those failures, and the next time will be more successful.
What's your opinion on? Obviously, you're based in California right now, so why do you think the companies that come? Well, it's not all of them. Amazon obviously came from Seattle, I think. But a lot of these Silicon Valley mentality companies, they don't seem to have that much issue innovating. Yet when you compare it to, the Walmarts and everything, they do innovate, but not on the same pace. I guess very relevant what happened this weekend was SpaceX launched, and first manned crew, commercial manned crew, but we kind of all know it's public that NASA gave the contract to Boeing and SpaceX. And Boeing, established company, probably way more money than a SpaceX. And somehow SpaceX had this Silicon Valley mentality and they made it first. So what is it about that mentality and those companies that they tend to keep innovating at a much faster pace and keep growing, Apple becoming $1 trillion company, that kind of stuff, and yet the older generation of companies, I would say, seem to have trouble with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's the observation's right on, and I think it starts with the company culture, and that starts with the leadership. What are the values? How do you reward? How do you incentivize? If you don't allow for failure and you don't encourage failure, you don't take those big steps, you don't take the risks. And I think at big companies, the price of failure is too high. And there's a cost that's perceived, whether it's real or not, in terms of how it may impact your career or how it may impact your compensation. Whereas I think the companies that are really truly innovative set up an ecosystem where that type of behavior is really rewarded, incentivized, encouraged, and recognized. And I just think big companies, are have to balance protecting their existing profits, and I think this is where sometimes it's hard to do the innovation inside the big company.
But so, how do you incentivize fail? Because a lot of companies say, "Hey, we want you to fail and everything." How do you incentivize failure? How do you make sure that people do the failures? And I mean, I guess you're head of strategy, so you have a little bit more say or know what's going on. So, how do you incentivize that?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, at North Face, we're probably not doing enough of it. We've been experimenting with some new business models. We launched North Face Renewed, which is a re-commerce model. So we take product that's been damaged in our supply chain or returned and professionally clean it, fix it to look like new status, and then resell it. There's a huge environmental impact of that in terms of keeping product out of landfill that otherwise would have gotten there. But part of the business model is to push and test and try to engage with consumers in new ways. And we initially launched it. It was launched. It was being led by somebody on our sustainability team. And again, from an environmental standpoint, he had the passion, he had the energy, and it was an awesome. Did as good a job as he could, but he wasn't necessarily a business person in the sense of how do you think about inventory management, merchandising, marketing strategy, connecting all the dots. So we actually brought in somebody else with a background. Well, back in the day, he had worked at North Face. He actually went to a different retailer and helped start up their private label business, then was at Amazon for a couple of years, helped them start up a apparel private label business, and then we brought him in. And so he brings some of that sense and understanding of who we are, understanding of who, product, but also a little bit of that Amazon entrepreneurship and just, kind of a different speed, a different level of agility. So I think part of it is you can encourage the behavior, but some of it is a learned skill. And I think you asked why so many startups kind of come out of the Silicon Valley, and I think part of it is that mentality, but part of it is some of these companies that came before are training grounds and instilling that behavior, and that's all people know. They're not patient. They're not going to sit around waiting for things to happen. They're going to make them happen. And I think by blending some of those new skills with some of the more traditional skills you need in different industries, it's a really valuable combination where you can make really good progress in a short amount of time. But in terms of you got to our conversation earlier, the reward and the incentive has to be there, and that what we found was, while we have one person leading it, they can't do it in a silo. They need to be plugged in with people across the organization to connect all the dots. And so a lot of the work has been done this year to connect those dots for us, so that there's one single point of ownership, but there's a connection to the rest of the business, and that's really helped fuel the growth of that channel for us. So that's one story. I don't know if that kind of illustrates exactly what you're getting at.
Well, so what I'm drawing from what you're saying right now is, in order to innovate an older business model, you have to actually bring in somebody who comes from a newer business model. Or so, for instance, let's say we're running our business, and at one point we're kind of hitting a dead end. At that point, it would kind of be futile to keep pushing and doing things ourselves. It'd be better to maybe hire a consultant or somebody who had worked at a more innovative company and change up the strategy.
Yeah, I think not in every situation, but I think in a lot of situations, at least understanding externally what is that behavior, what is that model that makes them successful, and whether it's hiring a consultant, hiring somebody full time, or at least having a number of conversations. And so, over the last 3 or 4 years, every consulting firm out there is talking about agile model, right?
Yeah.
And the notion of and all pitching that they can set up war rooms and kind of help teams learn how to do agile process. And I think in many ways, bringing a consultant to help you set that up can be helpful. But the problem is, unless you clear off people's work plans to free up the time for them to do that, change what they're being measured on, so that it doesn't work. So I think bring that consultant in or bring that external perspective is part of the solve, but it's not enough. You need to really figure out how to make those new systems work, and and whether you need them broadly across the company or you only need them in certain pockets. So one example is maybe 80% of your business operation stays the same and keeps marching down that path, but what you do is, for the other 20%, figure out how to drive that agility. And so you drive enough of the newness, enough of the innovation where you push forward while still having 80% of the organization kind of push on the traditional, so you don't lose that, obviously, because I think the challenge with big companies is, again, protecting the core while driving the newness and the innovation. It's a careful balance, and it's really tough, I think, for somebody to do both at once. I think you really have to be fully embedded in one or fully embedded in the other.
So you're saying at all times, in the perfect scenario, obviously you'd have 80% just driving profits, the revenue, and your existing business model, but then there would be this 20% small team, like an innovation team, and their business and their focus should be pretty much the future of the business model, but also potentially what can put us out of business right now, and maybe we should develop it first.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, 20% probably won't be focused on that, but 20%, a couple of people might be focused on that just from a headcount standpoint. But the 20%, how do you starting to bring that to life, right? Or thinking about innovation, because very few companies, other than SpaceX and a few others, could afford having a lot of people kind of sitting here just thinking. And I do think there is dangerous. And again, depending on the type of innovation you're trying to launch. If you're trying to do a standalone kind of innovation that can stand alone by itself, then it makes sense to carve it off completely. I think if you're trying to build a business model then it has to integrate back to the base business, there is danger about having it too separated. And that's why I talked about when we hired this person, they brought some skills for the North Face Renewed, but a lot of our work has been how does that integrate with what we're doing today, because otherwise it becomes two different brands, two different businesses, and you lose some of that scale, that efficiency, and without the pull from the mother brand, it just won't ever get to be big enough that it will matter, right? Okay. So I do think putting up too many silos, too many walls, while it may speed up your initial incubation phase, it will slow down eventually your integration and scaling phases.
Okay, so pretty much innovation is very fast in the beginning, but when you're innovating within a corporate, there's a longer term game that you have to play, and then scale that innovation can pretty much wind down very fast if done wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd almost think about it as kind of three wheels. There's a really fast wheel that's thinking about what is changing in the world, what are our competitors doing, what do we need to do to innovate, what could break through. Then there's kind of the medium wheel that takes those key ideas and kind of build something and kind of innovates, incubates, and starts working with parts of the organization. And then there's that third wheel, which is really that scale wheel, which moves a lot slower, but ultimately is the biggest wheel. And today, you're most important from a profit standpoint. And so I think, and it's, if you think about how those wheels connect, it's important they stay integrated, but it's also important that you don't slow down those first two wheels too much. Otherwise, you're just not going to come up with big enough ideas that will move the needle and set you up for success long term.
Yeah. Before I move on to a question that we had from the audience as well, you covered scale, and scale I've noticed is one of the hardest things to achieve. So, we're quite small, but yet we're trying to achieve scale now, and for us that is mostly a global thing, going to different countries, setting up digital experiences and stuff like that. But I've noticed it's just on the one end, you might have a startup or an idea and an experienced entrepreneur who knows how to set up teams, how to do things, get it to traction, and it could be like a nice business. But then there's this different wheel, like you said, which is scale. And obviously, you are like a global head, so it's a little bit different than just, a mom and pop store. So could you elaborate maybe a little bit more about the scale wheel, like you said it? Like, what is it that some startup, or I don't think it's a startup problem, I think it's more of an entrepreneur problem or founder problem. Like, what is it that some founders do that makes scale possible and other founders don't do that thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to kind of, I'd say two things. One is the skill set of the leadership team, and do they know what skill looks like in terms of from an operations standpoint. And this is often where you see startups kind of pull in kind of industry experts into their leadership team, or at least kind of different layers of management team. People have been there before. So how do you set up a supply chain? How do you that can scale, that can grow? How do you set up a sales team that can reach new customers? All that good stuff. So I think one is kind of a skill thing, and again, people can learn it, but it's going to take a founder a lot more time to learn it through research and all that stuff, and they'll make mistakes. Or you could go out and hire it and plug those people into the right roles to help leverage their knowledge level, leverage their connections. So I think that knowledge, that skill is one thing. I think the other thing is timing. I think oftentimes startups fail to scale because they either try to scale too early or too late. And I go back to the consumer packaged good example. I consult for a couple small consumer package companies, and the question is always, when should I go into grocery stores? And if you think about grocery stores primarily are a great refill channel. If you're a small startup, it's really tough to get a lot of brand awareness or brand trial in grocery stores, especially big mainstream grocery stores. So if you can think about, and even if you get into a grocery store, you have to hit certain velocity metrics to stay on the shelf. You have to sell a certain number of products per week. Otherwise, the grocery store just doesn't care.
Really? They just pretty much cut you out if you don't hit those numbers?
So if you're not turning fast enough, you're going to get kicked off the shelf quickly anyway. So again, you can get scale quickly, but then you'll lose it quickly. So thinking about velocity, thinking about when you're ready to make sure that you're going to have that long-term sustained growth is really important, and not going too fast. So from a consumer packaged goods standpoint, the analogy is, are you better actually going to coffee shops and gyms and corner stores, or smaller markets, restaurants, where people can try your product, sample it, get familiar with it, and then once you see enough traction, then go into some regional grocery stores. And again, do sampling, build up awareness, and then go into national grocery stores. So there is an evolution that, when are you going to be ready to make that next jump? And do you have that consumer traction to justify that next jump? Because again, as you know, in the startup world, if you go in and have a failure, that will scare away investors if you're all of a sudden taking a down round, or not missing your targets. So I do think going too quickly is often a concern. I think on the flip side, especially on the technology side, you can go too slow in some cases if your competitive advantage isn't strong enough, that there really is that first mover's advantage. And if you really need to brand it and get out there and be known as the X of the category.
Great. So okay, so we have a new segment on the show called the crash and burn segment. The crash and burn segment is pretty much what you hear, where we ask our speakers what were the biggest failures that you didn't expect, and what were the learning lessons out of it. Obviously, stories that you can share.
Oh man. I guess, um, yeah, I mean, I would say one of the not necessarily failures, but probably disappointments in my career was after when I was at Procter and Gamble. After leaving Mr. Clean, I moved to the Gillette brand, which on paper, especially being at the time, a late 20-year-old guy, was probably one of the more fun, more sexy businesses you can be on because it's all about sports and a lot of sports marketing and all global. And I think I moved into a role that Gillette is billions of dollars, so your span of control is much lower than what I had experienced on Mr. Clean, where I got to own it end to end. We had also pivoted from a regional company to a global company, so we had basically global strategy and innovation headquartered in the U.S., but then each region kind of controlled its own P&L from a sales standpoint. And the role I moved into was a global innovation role for kind of products like deodorants and shaving creams and all that good stuff. And it was pitched to me as you get to own the strategy, you get to drive the innovation, kind of drive the thinking. And what I realized pretty quickly into the role is whoever owns the P&L really owns the strategy, because they're the ones that, if they're gonna decide what's gonna make them money or what's gonna lose them money. And so what the role turned into was a lot of internal negotiations in terms of trying to convince Asia or trying to convince the Americas or South, Europe to take certain products or do certain things certain ways. And what I found personally was, one, I don't have a lot of patience for politics, and two, what I really enjoy is getting to help set the strategy, the vision for the overall brand. I don't enjoy just owning a little piece of it. And in this role, I felt like I owned a very little piece, and I was spending all my time negotiating internally versus really getting to impact what consumers saw, what they felt, the vision, the future of the brand. And so that learning helped me take a step back and say, what is it I want to do in my career? How do I want to spend my time? What gives me personally the energy and excitement? And for me, again, it was kind of this connection point between consumer and growth, and really feeling like I had a strong impact, and not just on a piece of something, but on the whole thing. And so ultimately I decided at Procter and Gamble, I probably wasn't going to get that for a number of years until you work your way up through the system. And that's what drove me go back to consulting. So I left there in about 2010 and spent the next 8 or 9 years at 2 different consulting firms. One was called Kurt Salmon, which is now owned by Accenture. The other one's McKinsey. And I did similar work across both of them. I worked about half my time with retailers and consumer good companies, helping them figure out how to grow, which was a lot of fun. And then I spent the other half of my time working with private equity investors, helping them identify companies to buy, or in helping them figure out if they bought them, could they grow them at the level they needed to get their money back. So in both sets of those work, it really was about looking at companies comprehensively. For the private equities, it's about evaluating them from front to back. And when you're doing growth strategy with companies, it's really understanding, the brand, the consumers, the marketplace, but also the internal operations. And so what I found through both of those experiences was I just enjoyed my job much more because I was getting to solve real problems. And, again, it was most of the brands we were working with were either looking to figure out how to grow much faster or needed to help turn around. And so I much enjoy that versus kind of just maintain a status quo. But that learning at Gillette in terms of having an experience of something I really just didn't enjoy, it just wasn't having fun, really helped shape that step and, helped me get to where I am today.
Nice. So when you were moving on from that job to the next job, at one point you said you also started covering working together with private equity investors,
Yep.
which is, I think, a little bit different to what you were doing so far. So how did you end up there? Like, yeah, did you
Yeah.
network and meet somebody, or what happened?
Yeah, it was all networking and actually going through my business school job board. Um, I had never heard of this consulting company called Kurt Salmon. It was relatively small. But what I did like it was it focused 100% on consumer retail industry, in which again was the only industry I'd ever worked in. Um, and so I had a knowledge base that I felt like I could use, and then it solved problems that sounded exciting to me. And and to be honest, I was initially more drawn by the work they talked about with their growth strategy with consumer and retail companies. And this PE thing sounded exciting, but to be honest, I had no idea what it was, and I had no idea what I was essentially getting myself into. But I figured, you know, it would push me, it would help me continue to learn, and I think I also understood that I wanted to look at companies from multiple different angles. And so when you're working on traditional consulting companies on growth strategy, you're working with the C-suite or you're working with business leaders and seeing it from their point of view and how to manage a business. But I also felt like when you're working with private equity investors, you're looking at it from a totally different set of stakeholders and seeing how they evaluate companies, how they look at what makes a company successful. I think the other really interesting thing about it is um, the projects were all very short, which sometimes you get on consulting. You hear consultants being with a client for a year or 2 years or even 6 months. When the projects I tended to work on were when you're working with the private equity companies, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. If you had 4 weeks, it was like a luxury. Now you're cramming like 10 weeks of work into that time period, so you're working really hard and really late, pulling some all nighters maybe. But what it does mean is you get exposed to a total bunch of business models in a very short amount of time because you're cycling through different companies. You're learning, you're seeing what's working. Then the next week you're working on something totally different. So it increases your speed of learning, but it just gives you exposure to a whole bunch of models, and then you can kind of draw in lessons learned across all of them in terms of what is really valuable, both from an investor standpoint, but also to build a long-term sustainable brand that people want to buy and spend money on.
So what are some of the lessons learned, or like what were maybe stories again, like what were definitely no-goes and definitely like those people, obviously you have a week or two to look at something and then decide these people are going to make it or not. So what are you looking at? And
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to a couple of things I talked about before. I think that, again, there's three things that separate a company that can sustain long-term growth. One is having a strong competitive moat, and again, the notion of it can either be kind of superhero or superhuman. If it's in the middle, it's
right.
probably going to get swallowed by somebody or kind of hit some issues. That consumer obsession or a really strong understanding of its consumers, but also an understanding of how it's going to grow. So, sometimes some mistakes that startups or young companies make is you really know your consumer, but you're targeting a very, very small set of consumers, or you're only solving one problem for them. And that may be great for your initial product, but how do you turn from a product company into a brand company where you can show that you can make more than one product be successful? And oftentimes it comes down to how they're setting themselves up, and sometimes you set yourself up too narrowly, which is great for the short term, but making sure you're expandable. And then the
Can you
third
give an example of setting yourself up too narrowly? Like how would that look like, maybe in a story or something?
Yeah, so we were working with we were assessing an energy bar company. And the energy bar company, had
Like energy bar, as in energy bar, like what you eat during a marathon or something.
exactly, or a snack,
Okay.
a snack bar.
Yeah.
And essentially, they were targeting really, really consumers that are really, really focused on protein, and kind of gym fanatics that they're really trying to gain bulk up a lot of muscle.
Right.
And that market is less concerned about necessarily the taste of the product, the texture. They're concerned about how much protein can this pack in it. And based on where the company was already, they were at least already had really strong distribution in kind of the classic nutritional channels that kind of those gym guys shop at. And so they achieved growth by kind of conquering that domain. But the question is, where was the next set of growth going to come from? So if a private equity firm is coming in and evaluating, they're not going to just pay for what you've done historically. What they want to see is the upside for them, as well as an upside for the next acquirer, whatever they're going to do afterwards, right? So you have to show that there's a lot of headroom left. And because this product was so targeted as kind of small niche of people that, the gold, almost like if you know Gold's Gym, but like really bodybuilders, that is a pretty small set of the market compared to the overall market, and it's also a market with a lot of competitors and a lot of protein solutions. And so if you want to scale to be bigger and broader, you have to figure out how do you reach more consumers, because ultimately, there's a cap. You can get to X many $1 million, but otherwise the market's only so big. But if you have a product that is just about protein, one, somebody can come out with a product that has more protein in it and cannibalize you. And second, if you don't have good taste, it's hard to expand, right? So what we found was we actually had consumers do taste tests of the product, and by and far did not rate it very strongly. So unless they came out with a whole new formula to really hit the mainstream market, it just wasn't going to ever be successful. So that was the example of they nailed it for their muscle head at the time, but in terms of long-term growth in terms of a mainstream consumer, there just wasn't a there because they had kind of pinned themselves in a product that wasn't acceptable to a larger segment of consumers.
Clear. No, I get it now. But it's super interesting. So you pretty much took what you learned with Mr. Clean and Gillette and everything, and you started applying it to evaluate startups.
Yeah, and it was we looked at companies of all sizes, from a couple $1 million to several billion. So it was it was super helpful to see both the small ones, the medium ones, and the large ones, because you see how companies and the models have to change, as they scale, and what makes it successful, and where's the growth opportunity, or what's your growth hypothesis if you're an investor at different stages of the investment cycle or the company's life cycle.
So you just said that you also evaluated $1 billion companies then?
Yeah, we weren't doing valuations, but we were doing essentially due diligences. So helping them assess growth potential and brand health.
So could you then quickly explain what you just said with the differences between like a smaller, a mid-sized, and then the bigger potential companies? Like what kind of challenges each faced throughout the journey? And
yeah, sure. I think small companies, again, the focus was on typically what you see with small companies is that get in front of investors or PE that have some real sales, that have some early success. You can paint a really rosy picture around them because, hey, every year you're growing at 100% because you're growing off a really small base, right? And the question that is really important to understand there if you're an investor is, where's that source of growth and how sustainable is that source of growth? So if most of that growth is coming from new distribution, that's okay, but it's not as exciting if a lot of that growth is coming from, again, the notion of velocity increase, repeat purchase, consumer love. So if in your points of distribution that you exist, you're seeing significant growth, that is a sign of tremendous brand health. That the consumers that you're getting in front of are coming back, repurchasing. So if you're only getting growth, if your velocity is decreasing as you expand, again, you're either expanding too quickly or maybe the product isn't as scalable as you thought because it's not as accepted or is not as bought by more mainstream consumers. As you get bigger and middle kind of tier companies, where you haven't established brand love and you've showcased enough velocity to start scaling. I think there's really a couple of questions left is how much more distribution out there is there for you. So if you're a retailer or a restaurant at the time, the notion was how many more doors could you open by looking at kind of the geography expansion and how much sales you'd project for each of those doors. And the other question was around regionality. So we did a diligence on, at the time, burger chains. So
burger what?
Like a hamburger chain.
Oh, okay, hamburger chains. Yeah.
So at the time, there was a lot of energy and a lot of excitement going around about this notion of kind of better hamburger chain. So not the McDonald's and Burger King fast food, but kind of that one level up, maybe $8 to $12 burgers. They're kind of fancier, better quality. And there's a lot of different ones in the U.S. that started in different regions. And the chain that we were evaluating for a private equity firm was really strong and dominant in their region. Everybody loved it. And if you talk to their consumers, it was their favorite thing since sliced bread. And the interesting thing is, as they moved into new markets, they didn't necessarily see as much success. And the question was, is that because they didn't have as much brand awareness and people just didn't know about them yet? Or was it because that as they expand to different regions, there were other competitors that people preferred more? And what we actually found in this circumstance was there were other chains that people preferred more. And so the notion of just being able to grow and pour money in marketing and drive awareness, that might have worked to some extent, but they were never going to see the type of returns that they saw in their home market in other markets because these other regional chains were stronger. So it's sort of that type of analysis that you do to really understand what is that growth potential. And then the long term, the bigger companies, it really is about brand love, sustainability of that, fashion cycles, trends, what competitive set is, loyalty there, and then identifying what are growth levers that if the private equity firm invested in, it could drive other returns. And that's where you have to get a little creative because big companies in some ways may have already maxed out the easy stuff to do. And are there new, different, innovative things, whether it's a new business model, a new channel, a new product launch, that could really transform their growth with a little bit of capital investment?
So we're talking now about billion-dollar companies. So what type of, they've maximized probably everything that they've already been doing. So you're saying some of the only ways that they can then grow is launching just new things. So pretty much like an Apple that launched an iPad or an iPhone.
Exactly. Yeah. So one example was we were evaluating a retailer of pet supplies. And so the question was, could they really launch and scale a line of actually a service offering to do pet grooming, some veterinary services, pet sitting, that sort of thing. So the idea is you've got your core products, you have consumers coming in, but can you take that consumer and capture more share of wallet by expanding your business model?
Yeah. So before I move on to the next question, this has always been super interesting to me, and obviously you've really been evaluating the businesses of these founders. So if you look at the founder structure, like founders versus co-founders, and then you look at the small, mid-tier, and like the big businesses, did you see differences in, so by the time they were billion-dollar companies, how many of the founders were still in the business, and was it, what are there sole founders who were there? Were there most of them were co-founders, and what type of people were they?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, by the time they got to mid-sized companies, they were less. There may have been some co-founders, but that's where really a lot of the co-founders maybe have stepped aside, either because the company was older and had been around longer, or you know, the founders or co-founders realized that, again, maybe what they liked to do was not necessarily running mid or big size companies, but it was more the innovation, the entrepreneurship. And again, if we're all honest with ourselves and kind of do a self-reflection in terms of where we get our energy and what makes us happy, I'm a big believer in terms of the more time you can spend doing the things that bring you joy, the happier you're going to be throughout your life. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, one, kind of go through that phase in terms of realizing maybe that they're kind of getting grogged down by things they don't enjoy. And oftentimes when companies reach that point, the founders have the luxury, because they've got the resources to maybe step aside. I think some do it better than others. But there's plenty of founders where the company's their baby and they want to see it through. And you look at Zuckerberg or Bezos, and they still get the joy, but they're able to find other sources of getting the innovation that they like to do, pushing the limits, and maybe they leave some of the day-to-day operations of the base business to other people. So I think it really depends. I think it does require, even if the founders stayed the same, again, are they bringing in people to help professionalize? I think. I did a consulting work for a very fast-growing shoe brand, and they caught fire and did an amazing job, but they didn't have the people, they didn't set up the systems, they didn't continue to innovate. They had one great product, and what you saw is tremendous growth, and then a very, very quick decline, and they've never recovered because they didn't professionalize, and they tried to bring in people too late, after the consumers had long left them by and moved on to competitors.
Oh, sad. Okay, so I want to then, slowly as we're wrapping up, I want to go back to one of the things that you said that I definitely wanted to hear more about, and it kind of ties into one of the other segments that we have, which is impact talks. So we always ask about some impact stories that you've had. So if you said at Gillette you started realizing you wanted to do more impact there, so you couldn't do it there, so you wanted to then move on. So then the question that I might have is, what is something throughout your entire career that you've worked on that had the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, in my career, I spent the first 4 years consulting, and then after business school, went to Procter & Gamble, and then nearly a decade back in consulting before coming to North Face. And I think the interesting thing about consulting is you feel like you have a lot of impact in the moment, and some of that impact stays on, but maybe you don't necessarily see it because you've moved on, and you don't always recognize it. So I'm very proud of a lot of the projects my teams did there, and the impact you see from as a consumer going into the market and seeing it come to life. But I think there's nothing like being part of a company, and that's why it was super fun when North Face reached out to me and convinced me to leave consulting to come back to a company that you see the same people every day, you see the same business every day, and you get to help really grow and shape it and impact the direction of the brand. And I think North Face, going back to my childhood, it was always one of my favorite brands growing up. I literally remember the day that I got my first North Face jacket. Like I said, I have a twin sister, and I literally remember, and I can't remember how old we were, 8 or 10 or something like that, running into the store, and I'm like, I'm getting the blue one, and she's like, I'm getting the red one, and we wore those jackets for the next several years. And as a consumer, I watched the North Face for many years and a couple decades, and it felt like it lost some of that magic. It felt like it had become a seller of great functional jackets, but not again that emotional connection, that lifestyle brand that people aspire for. So, when North Face reached out to me, I felt like it was one of those few times in your career where you can go to an iconic brand, but again, an iconic brand that needs a little brand love. And, for me, like I said before, I get bored in situations where it's just status quo. And, there was a license to come here and there was a new leadership team in place. And we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years to really pivot the brand strategy. We rolled out a new brand purpose. Why do we exist? What role do we play for our consumers? Done a lot of work to understand, what does exploration even mean? We say never stop exploring, but how do you define exploration? And how do you bring that to life in a way that's meaningful? And, now more than ever, more accessible and more diverse than ever been. I mean, if you look at outdoor brands historically, the imagery has been around, for lack of better words, like a middle-aged Caucasian man on the top of a mountain by himself. And very few people ever experience that. But how do you make exploration something that really anybody can do anywhere? It's really about the mindset versus an extraordinary expedition. How do we redefine our values? How do we think about our consumers in new ways so we can reach new, younger consumers, more diverse consumers that may not have as much experience going into the outdoors and may need a little help? So it's been a lot of fun over the last couple of years, really thinking about that, really helping shape that. And while it all hasn't fully showed up in the marketplace yet, I'm super excited to see it come to life over the next couple of years.
Nice. So then, does that mean that you guys do new products as well as you start shaping, or I guess going back to the roots or redefining this new brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it is the messaging and the imagery that I talked about and, how we come across, but we've done a lot of work on product innovation. And if you think about what made North famous in the first place, we invented categories. We invented new product classes that many other people have. So last year, we made a recommitment to this innovation and leading the category forward. We launched what's called Future Light, which is a new waterproof, breathable technology. So if you think about a rain jacket, for example, all rain jackets may keep you dry from the weather on the outside, but if you think about your rain jacket and walk around the city or in the woods, if you have it on, you're probably getting pretty sweaty inside, right? And maybe not something we all talk about or think about, but if you actually think back to running around in a rain jacket, you're probably sweating. And the great thing about that rain jacket is keeping you dry on the outside. The bad thing is it's not letting any moisture out from the inside. And so Future Light is really the first breathable waterproof solution where it allows you to stay dry from the rain, but it breathes in a way that lets that sweat and that heat out and keeps you cooler, drier. And if you think about that, what's great about our innovation is it all starts from our athletes. It all starts from real mountaineers, real climbers. And if you're thinking about climbing in an extreme situation, you need to stay dry.
Right.
And as soon as you get wet and your base layers get wet and it's cold, you can't recover from that. And so the innovation really came from the mountain, and we're bringing that to our athletes. We're bringing that to mountaineers, but we're also bringing that to everyday consumers because it solves a real problem that we can all relate to. So that's one example. We also just launched what we call our Advanced Mountain Kit, which is a whole new line of insulation. So if you think about, again, starting with our athletes, one of the biggest changes in the industry for climbers is historically the way climbing was done is people put on these big heavy suits and took a couple of days to climb up mountains. Now the notion what climbers are trying to do is do really rapid ascents and descents. And so you need much lighter weight product that can keep you warm, but also are lighter. And so we've kind of come out with a bunch of innovation around thinking about down jackets, thinking about fleece jackets to help solve some of those real problems. And there's a big international show in Europe every year called ISPA, which is kind of for a lot of sport and outdoor brands, and we won Best of Show there for some of that product. So we're excited to see it come to life in the marketplace over the next couple of years too.
So in some ways, what you were doing at the beginning of your career, now as you went into North Face, your consumers that you used to pay $100 for are now your athletes that you listen to and develop new technologies for, that then obviously can go to the mass consumers as well.
Yeah, we do a mix. Obviously, we want to talk to our mainstream consumers too. So we do a lot of work with our athletes, and they're our inspiration. But we all obviously have to make sure that as we take that product, that it connects relevantly and solves problems for consumers. So, one great example is when you're designing climbing gear. Climbers want really long sleeves, because when you reach up, you don't want your sleeve to come back down here when you're outside, right? But what that means for an everyday consumer is, if you're walking around the street, you don't want your sleeves coming down well over your hands, right? So you do have to make some adjustments. You do have to understand what are the friction points with your consumer. So while you talk to your athletes, they're the inspiration of everything we do. The consumers are ultimately really important, and that consumer obsession is critical.
That's it's interesting, because the extreme situations, so the athletes can drive the spark for the idea, and then you can adjust that towards the main public to make it actually day-to-day wearable. That's I've never thought about it that way. Yeah, so as we're nearing the end now, almost last question, random story segment we have now, something new that we added. So outside of business, what are you currently doing or learning? So let's just park this 2-hour discussion that we just had about business and startups and equity. But just obviously you're outdoorsy. What are you currently doing or learning, especially now that Corona, we're all locked up, that gives you energy?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question, because the world we're living in over the last couple of months is such a different world. So, I mean, in many ways, that's preoccupied a lot, and obviously because of Corona and COVID, and its impact on retail, taking up a ton of time in terms of how we're managing our business. One silly thing is, I was always very active. I've always enjoyed hiking, going to the gym, but I was never a big runner. Like I said before with the Nike shoe example, like I had Nike running shoes, but I never ran in them. But now, I try to get outside every day, even if it's only 20 minutes, and go for a run. And it's just a way of less about the exercise, although moving my body, I think it's helpful, but it's a chance to get outside for a little bit every day, clear my mind, and just kind of tune out. And I do think the importance of disconnecting, getting off the phone, getting off the computer is so important now more than ever, where it's so easy just to sit inside. And I think one of the, kind of just connecting back to North Face, the power of exploration, part of that is just getting out of your comfort zone, trying new things, and disconnecting from technology so you can reconnect with yourself, reconnect with your community, reconnect with the world around you. I think we just have to remind ourselves to do that now more than ever, because while we're all kind of held up alone in our houses, it's kind of one of the few times, at least in my life, if not the only time in my life, that people around the world are going through the same thing at once. And so there is something about that brings us together. Again, I think it's finding little things that remind us of that and kind of get us out of our Zoom lives and into real world again.
So the whole running is really new to this period right now. You just started running.
It started.
How was it? Was it fun, or was it something you didn't like?
Well, yeah. I mean, at first it was a little painful, I'll be honest, and very, very slow. But it's gotten a little bit faster, and now it's something that I definitely look forward to every day when I try to do it. It's kind of one of those, okay, that's something to look forward to. It's a little bit of an escape. So it's gotten to be fun, and it's gotten to be just a little bit of, my wife calls Dan time, where I can kind of just go and kind of check out and kind of just be within my own thoughts.
Yeah. I call it me time. Exactly. It's so funny you said that. I've never run my entire life. Like maybe I did like a 5K or a 10K for charity or something like that. Always being a sprinter, that type of thing. since March I started running. I did my first half marathon, obviously on my own with my run keeper and Apple Watch.
Well
But
done.
I did one 2 weeks ago on Sunday, and then yesterday I did one again. And so a week ago on the Sunday, so like more than 7 days ago, 8 days ago now, I did it, and it was in the shadow. So everything went fine. Obviously, my legs were broken the next day, but recuperated. Yesterday, I went on a track that had the sun, and I went on midday, and so burned myself completely.
Oh no.
Yeah, so I had a lot of trouble sleeping. But I mean, I have to say, it's exactly what you said. It's a little bit of me time and a little bit of quiet, which I have to say I probably would not have done if it wasn't for Corona. And now, actually, we're gonna have next week. I think we're gonna have an Ironman coach on.
Oh wow.
Yeah, she finished an Ironman. She's an Ironman coach, and I'm starting to explore ultra marathons and what it
Look at
takes
you.
to be Ironman. And so yeah, 2 months into my training, 2 half marathons already done, and my legs are, I think, starting to become strong enough to go for the marathon.
That's
And
impressive.
but it's super interesting that you also had that. So it's no, cool. Man, we're a bit over time. I do have to ask this before you go. One of our audience questions was, which books are you currently reading? Is there something interesting books-wise that you would recommend?
I actually, sadly, have not been reading as much lately. So not the perfect book to recommend right now.
No worries.
Normally I am a reader.
Do you have any
I te-
books from the past to recommend that you've read that you think?
I mean, I tend to read a lot of more of kind of American history, and then I tend to read some business books. I mean, I think from a business book standpoint, I think Shoe Dog is great, which is
Yeah,
the
from
Nike.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I really like the Starbucks books. I'm totally blanking on whether it's Onward or. But I think those books I tend to like, kind of like you talk about the notion of I don't love a business book, but I love a good story about business where you can learn.
Right.
And I think the understanding the founding of those companies, how they were built, and Amazon talks about or not Amazon, sorry, Starbucks. He talks about when he comes back after he stepped down from CEO, he comes back and the changes he had to make to get the company back growing. I mean, that really resonated to me. I was actually reading that book while working with a client on a turnaround strategy. And so there were a lot of comparisons and some lessons learned that I was able to reapply in my consulting project, which was great. But, those tend to be the books. And then, again, the history to just get out of business and just push myself. Because I do, I know we talked about it a little bit before, but, I do think there's a lot we can learn from looking back. And, one of the first things that when COVID kind of struck, the first thing I had my team do was look back at the last couple of recessions, actually going all the way back to the Spanish flu epidemic, and to understand the impact on business, to understand the impact in terms of consumer behavior, and to catalog those themes and just start to understand them. And what's amazing is the four or five of the themes that we catalog, they're absolutely coming true. So it is one of those
What are
things.
those? What are? Can you
Yeah,
share?
and they're very apparel specific, but one is around the notion of mindful consumerism. So the notion that consumers will cut back spending, but they will still spend, but their priorities shift. And so the notion of, if not to get too academic, but if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you look back at the last several decades, for the most part, a lot of apparel sales and consumer goods sales have been around kind of those higher principles of fulfillment and self-actualization and all that good stuff. But in the short term, when you have a crisis like this, consumers focus on the needs at the bottom, the basic needs. and the foundational needs. And you actually see that from what consumers start buying, how they spend their money. And so with that, how do you double back on reinforcing your value proposition? So thinking about, as opposed to fast fashion, consumers are going to be more focused on quality, durability. And, we have a lifetime warranty. So how do we use that lifetime warranty to reinforce that durability? How do you think about versatile product that can be used across multiple occasions versus specialty product? So that's kind of one area. Another area is conspicuous consumption. During times of recession, and you saw this in 2007, 2008, people shied away from flashy things that were status symbols, because even if you had money, because a lot of other people were hurting, you don't want to showcase that wealth as much. And you already see that, potentially in some streetwear, the notion of a little bit more silent streetwear, quiet, and how that may impact product design. You actually see, obviously, the shift to digital and having to, during times like this, consumer behavior changes. And to our conversation earlier, it doesn't always change back. And so how do you position yourself and shift and make sure that if digital's the primary way to connect with consumers, you're set up in a way that you're supporting that. And then, I think we're fortunate that you also, in many ways, you also see priority in terms of how consumers spend their time. We talked about our running, but it is a time during recessions where more consumers stay close to home, do the basics of the hiking, the camping, the running, things that North Face can really help them on. And you see kind of spikes in outdoor participation. So there are opportunities for us and opportunities for us to help consumers get back out there safely, obviously. So again, those are some of the themes, but again, you can see those similar patterns now, but you can see them back in 2007, 2008, or going back to other recessions too. So again, looking back to look forward is sometimes helpful.
I think that's so interesting. Some of them were obvious, but others were not so obvious to me. And I think one of the things I definitely learned from that last answer, which was unexpected, was the moment it hit, one of the first things you did was look back at the history, which was so smart, because I did not think to do that. I kind of looked a little bit, but I didn't go back to the history and really analyze the consumer behavior, which I guess that's what I learned from this talk, just analyzing that consumer behavior a bit better. So I really appreciate you sharing that. But I think, on that note, I think we can just wrap up, and then hopefully if you come on the next podcast, if you still want to come, we can revisit some of these topics, because I think we can still talk for hours, but we can wrap up here. So it's super
Sounds
happy
great.
that you came on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I had fun.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business question from the entire startup funding event team.